Carl is here. I'm sorry. I didn't hear you. I didn't hear the buzz, Carl. I'm sorry. How you doing, man? You doing okay?
I'm doing good. How are you, sir?
I'm doing fine. I am so sorry. I didn't hear the buzz. Usually there's a beat when the person comes on, and I didn't hear it this time around.
Okay,
Um,
next time I'll beat myself. I'll beat myself in.
you saved my ass this morning, Carl, because my guest flicked out. So I thank you for this. I thank
No
you for
worries.
this. Um, I had a conversation with KJ No, and in the conversation, I was asking him, we're coming up on the anniversary of the surrender of the Japanese to the Chinese. And I guess I was prodding him, like, can you go into how that started? It's a complicated, fascinating history where you get the situation where the Chinese, let's say the government, is fighting revolutionary forces, communist revolutionary forces. At the exact same time, there's an invasion by the Japanese. They join together to fight the Japanese while also continuously fighting each other. And then you think to yourself at the end of that, how the hell did the communists win that when they were the revolution as opposed to the government itself? There's so many questions with that. Like, it's a fascinating history. I've had the opportunity to read through it. I got to be honest, I haven't read that stuff in a very long time, so it's very vague to me. But it may be
That's
something
why you
interesting.
should subscribe. That's why you should subscribe to my podcast, Jamar. I had a whole series on the Chinese Civil War
Did
after
you?
1945. Yes. And so like, because this is really the most important events leading up to the 21st century. Now with the China's rise more apparent than ever, like it's very important to understand what led to China to this step. Because back in 1945, China was was desperately poor, was brutalized by invasion. I have a personal story to share about the Japanese surrender, because my dad was born in July 1945. So he was
Was
a
he?
baby in August. The Japanese surrender announcement was August 15th, right? The September 2nd or September 3rd, that's when they formally signed the unconditional surrender. So my when my dad was just barely a month old, um, the whole town, there was a widespread panic in my dad's hometown. The Japanese troops are coming.
Oh,
Because the last time the Japanese troop came through the town was in 1937 during the Battle of Shanghai, and they burned down the entire town. So people were really panicking, and everybody getting ready to evacuate. Because my dad is a baby, everybody was urging my grandma to ditch my dad, because baby cry will
really?
raise attention. Everybody was telling my grandma, get rid of the baby. We don't want Japanese to know where we are. Um, but of course, my grandma refused to give up my dad. Um, and it turns out it was all much ado about nothing, because the Japanese were coming to town to get on the train to head down to the next big city, Hangzhou, for the surrender, for the surrendering ceremony. So this is when August 15th, when the Japanese emperor issued announced the surrender over the radio. And so this is my story, like a very personal story about the Japanese surrender. My thanks for my grandma. I'm here. My dad is still alive. Um, but yeah, it's a this story is not unique. It's repeated across China. In fact, when I visited my dad's hometown in 2019, I noticed all the Buddhist temples in town were rebuilt after 1980s. I just naturally assumed they were destroyed during the Cultural Revolution. So I asked my dad. My dad's like, no. All the temples were bombed out in 1937 during the Battle of Shanghai when the Japanese came through. They firebombed the whole town. All the temples were destroyed. And of course, after the Japanese surrender, the Chinese Civil War got started. So nobody got around to rebuild those temples. and then Cultural Revolution happened. It's only until 1980s, people finally got around to rebuild those temples. and now there are quite many of them. Many of them very beautifully redone. But yeah, so China is recovering from that now. It took a couple generations. My dad was born basically at the end of the war, and my generation now back in China is actually they're the captain of these generations are the generation that made China great again. So
Oh,
yeah.
that is amazing. I mean,
Hmm.
people need to internalize what it would take for somebody to say, you need to get rid of that baby. Can you imagine that? Like just in a normal circumstance, like, hey, we're so scared about what's about to take place, all of the atrocities and everything else. You need to get rid of that baby because we don't want the Japanese to find us. It's like, okay, get rid of them where? Where? Don't, I mean, that's just, yeah, that's rough, Carl. That's rough. But fortunately, you are here. And I appreciate your
Yes.
dad for not doing anything drastic in that moment. No, I
Oh,
deeply
he was a
appreciate.
baby. My dad was a baby at that moment. There's
Oh,
nothing he could
oh,
have
I
done.
see. It was your grandmother and your. Okay, I see
My
what's going on.
grandma, my grandma, yes.
Okay, okay, okay. I misunderstood. Okay, I misunderstood. And yeah, duh. Right, logically, you should. I should know better.
Yeah.
Okay, okay. It's funny. Manila Jan, when she talks about stuff like that, and talks about like being in the Vietnam War, not her personally, but let's say her family and how they came over to the states and what they were going through in Laos and whatnot. It's the war. Like as Americans, we don't see that stuff. Like we don't get it. Like we don't get it in real terms. Like the desperation that people are under when they're in these war zones. It, it's almost like a video game to us, and that's to our detriment. Um,
Yeah.
so how did the war between the government itself, let's say the God, there's a very specific word for it that I'm missing that'll come to me in a moment, but the government itself and the opposition forces of the Communist Party, how did that clash start? Because that clash started before the Japanese invaded, correct?
Oh yeah, that happened a long time ago. I mean, like okay, so I didn't realize I'm coming here to give a lecture on the on the Chinese
I'm
modern
sorry.
history. But I'm very happy to do it. I'm very happy to do it because this is my forte. I love history. So the nationalist government, um,
That's the word I'm looking for.
they
The
they
national.
they they themselves they themselves were a rebel or revolutionary a government, if you will, because back in 1920s, the official government, Chinese government that was recognized by the League of Nations, sits in Beijing. But Sun Yat-sen at the time, he decided to start a rival government with his newly reformed Nationalist Party in Canton, China, which is today Guangzhou. Canton, that's
Okay.
where Cantonese came from. So he started his own government down in the south, and he received support from Soviet Union because Soviet Union at that time they wanted to break out of international isolation. They just fought off the Allied intervention in the Russian Civil War when United States
Yes.
of all powers send
Yes.
troops to Russia to invade Russia in the Arctic, both in Arctic Circle, in the ports of Murmansk, and in Siberia. Americans, Japanese, they all send troops to Siberia. Chinese too did
Yes.
because the Chinese under the Beijing government also sent troops because they were part of the so-called Allied intervention in the Russian Civil War. So understandably, the USSR decided to support this rebel government started by Sun Yat-sen in Canton, and they give a lot of money, weapons, and Soviet advisors with one condition that they need to work with the newly formed Chinese Communist Party, which just got formed in
Interesting.
1921.
Interesting.
The Chinese Communist Party at that time was very young. When Mao attended the meeting to found the Communist Party back in July 1921, there's like less than 100 members all across China. But the Soviet condition was okay. We'll give you all these weapons and money, but you have to work with the Chinese Communist Party. So the communist and the nationalists, the foreign coalition government, and they started the so-called Northern Expedition to to get rid of the Chinese warlords that was populating the rest of the country, including sitting in the government in Beijing. So they were very successful in 1927. This is after the death of Sun Yat-sen. One of the Sun Yat-sen's protege, Chiang Kai-shek, being a commander of the army, he kind of very quickly took over. He led the Northern Expedition, but when the Northern Expedition Force was about to take Shanghai, the Communist force under Zhou Enlai actually they snuck in Shanghai to stage a workers' uprising to get rid of the warlords first.
Yeah.
And when that happened, Chiang Kai-shek was very alarmed at the growing power of the communists, and Chiang Kai-shek himself actually traveled to the Soviet Union, and he didn't like what he saw. So he was suspect the communists were is gonna try to take over. So he decided to strike preemptively. He launched the Shanghai Massacre. He worked with the Shanghai mafia called Green Gang to stage a massacre. All the communist sympathizer, anybody who is suspected to be communist, 5,000 people were killed in Shanghai. This was a Shanghai Massacre in 1927. So that caused a split between the communist and the nationalist government. And Mao led some of these remnant communists to stage a guerrilla movement in the countryside. And so this is when this communist nationalist war started. This was way back in 1927. But the two sides fought on until. So a lot of people only know the World War II started when Germany invaded Poland in 1939. But for the Chinese, the war started long before that because the Japanese launched a surprise attack in 1931 to take over Manchuria in what's called Mukden X incident. And ever since, Japan has been at war with China. And there was battle in Shanghai in 1931-32. There was battle on the Great Wall in 1933. And there was Chiang Kai-shek decided to make peace because he said, the foreign invaders, that's like the disease. The Japanese, they're like the disease of the skin. The communists, there's a disease of the heart. So so I'm gonna have to get rid of the communists first before we can unite as one to resist the Japanese. So he decided to make peace with the Japanese in 1933, and to focus on extermination campaign on the communists. But this forced the communists to start a long march from their southern communist base, wandering through halfway through China, finally ended in northwest China. And then Chiang Kai-shek sent the warlords, Manchurian warlord Zhang Xueliang, who just lost his homeland Manchuria, to go attack the communists. But for Chiang Kai-shek, was two birds with one stone. He get rid of the communists and the warlord Zhang Xueliang his forces at the same time. But Zhang Xueliang was losing against communists, and he realized what is going on. And all his subordinates want to go fight the Japanese because they want to go home. They're like, what the hell we're doing in the northwest fighting the communists when we want to go back to northeast when the Japanese had taken over our homes. So his subordinates are not very happy. Then in 1936, when Chiang Kai-shek came to visit, went to Xi'an to visit Zhang Xueliang to oversee the final extermination campaign of the communists, Zhang Xueliang actually had collaborated with communists beforehand. So he staged a coup. He arrested Chiang Kai-shek. And that's when he forced Chiang Kai-shek to sign an agreement that he will work for a united front with the communists to fight the Japanese. So Chiang Kai-shek, in exchange for his own life, he agreed to sign this agreement, broadcast all over. And to Chiang Kai-shek's credit, he stayed by that. So after that, he was released. Zhang Xueliang himself flew Chiang Kai-shek back home in Nanjing, but Chiang Kai-shek immediately placed him under house arrest for the rest of his life. Zhang Xueliang died in like 2001 in Hawaii. He was held under house arrest until like 1980s, and he was only allowed to leave Taiwan like after the 80s to go retire in Hawaii. But
wow.
But but then when the Japanese realized these two forces are working together, so they start to launch a full-scale invasion of China in 1937 in the so-called Marco Polo incident, when they launched attack against Beijing, and so all these battles were raging in China way before you know the
Europe.
battles broke out in Europe, in the Eastern Front. So for the Chinese, it's basically a war since 1931 to 1945, a war of 14 years, and yeah, and but then so that's but what communists did was when the Japanese came, much of northern China before were under various Chinese warlords that had nominal allegiance to the nationalist government. What the
Mhm.
Japanese did, they destroyed all those the hold on power of these Chinese warlords, and created a power vacuum in the countryside, because the Japanese were only interested in capturing the big cities and the transportation, the main rail lines connecting each cities. So that gives a chance for the communists to move in to develop their bases in the countryside, and they started to take over the countryside behind the enemy lines. That's when by the end of the war, by 1945, a lot of
Mhm.
the Chinese communists were able to control much of the northern China countryside. They just didn't have all the Japanese were holed up in the big cities and along the railway links, and then when the Japan finally surrendered, there was a race between the communists and the nationalists to rush to those occupied cities to accept the Japanese surrender. This is where U.S. came in. U.S. deployed 60,000 troops, 50,000 Marines to carry out so-called the Operation Beleaguered, with ostensible goal to ship the surrender Japanese troops and civilians back to Japan. But their other very important role was also to ship Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist troops from southwest China, where they had been held up, to northern China to accept the Japanese surrender, because they didn't want big cities like Beijing, Tianjin to fall into communist hands. And then this is how Chinese Civil War got started. And then then for 5 years, for 4 years, the war waged on, but the nationalists lost out. That's a whole fascinating topic.
Excellent pile on. Right.
I recommend everyone to subscribe my podcast if you want the whole
Yes.
story.
Silk and Steel. And just so we did,
Yeah.
because I didn't give you the heads up when you got on, just because I had somebody else's thing violin. Called Ja, host of Silk and Steel podcasts, focused on China, surrounding regions, in history, culture, politics. He did this off the top of his head. Names it all. He did it off the top of his head. Well, you can follow Carl on Twitter at Carl Shaw. You can find his podcast on Twitter at Steel Silk In. And you can subscribe and support the podcast at patreon.com. Silk It's Steel. So I just wanted to give you a bio. I wanted people to know where they can get that history.